Red Saints. I move. We are Red Saints.
Great, thank you, thank you. And I'm ready as well, so it's a good coincidence. Comrades, what we're going to do, we've got our program scheduled to run until lunchtime. And then everybody can go to lunch, and then there's a whole afternoon for lots more chatting and interaction and networking and building connections. But for what we're going to do now is try and consolidate the discussions that we've been having for the last 2 days. So it's quite a big task because a lot of issues came up, a lot of things have been thrown up, and there needs to be a lot of discussions on those issues. Just to very briefly outline how we thought the morning could go. First of all, if I will just run through and kind of outline some of the key issues that seem to have emerged over the last 2 days. Okay, I might not have captured everything. In fact, I'm sure I haven't captured everything, but I've tried to identify and put down the key things that have emerged. Then we thought that we would break people into groups so that there can be a little bit more of an intense discussion, focusing on questions around, right, well, now we've had these discussions, we've seen these issues emerge, how do we move it forward? How do we consolidate what we've discussed, and how do we move it forward? Come back for plenary report backs, and then kind of have a discussion on the concrete issues that we can be collaborating on and focusing on, and where to from here, so that we don't just all walk out of here this afternoon and move on to the next thing in our very busy lives, and this gets left behind. But that there are concrete steps, there are concrete actions, there's concrete kind of plans in place for us to collaborate, work together, network, etc., moving forward. So comrades, that's the plan for the day, if that's all right. Just also to say that part of the thinking of AIDC, CHUED, TNI, in planning this workshop, this conference, was the idea that coming out of the conference, or rather kind of after the conference, we would collaborate together on producing a document on Eskom and the kind of future of Eskom, drawing in the unions, hopefully working together to say, well, what do we see in it? We recognize the need for a transition. Even if there wasn't the sort of need for an energy transition, there's a need to do something about Eskom. How do we see a future for Eskom in moving towards? Is there a role for Eskom to be a vehicle in moving towards a low carbon economy? What role can and should Eskom be playing, and what does Eskom what needs to change in Eskom for it to play that role? So that's still very much part of our thinking of what we'd like to do coming out of this conference. So hopefully the discussion and the debates and the kind of areas of collaboration can feed into that and that. Let me just so the questions that we're hoping that the groups can talk about. As I said, how can we consolidate discussions, pull together around key issues moving forward? What are the key issues we should be focusing on, given the range of crises we face? So I'm talking about the range of crises that we're facing in South Africa generally. As was said yesterday, we went into a technical recession. We know whether we're in a recession or not. We've got huge unemployment, inequality. We've got the crisis that Eskom is in, the crisis that local government's in. So there's lots and lots of problems. And what are the issues that we focusing on the areas that we can work in? What is it that we should be focusing on? How can we take work around those issues forward? And are there specific issues or events that we should be mobilizing around? How can we do this, and who will take the lead? So there, we could be thinking of things like the IRP 2018 and our response to it. We could be thinking of things like the climate change bill, the Chinese investments that we spoke about yesterday, the new multi-year tariff determination that's going to be coming up. So there's various kind of issues, concrete issues that we could be working around as part of a broader process of looking at how we move forward. So comrades, is that broadly all right, that kind of structure for how we take forward this morning's discussion? Brief overview, group discussions, plenary report back, and try and consolidate the discussion and move forward. Okay, I'm going to take that as given, that's fine. And move on to, as I said, this is just a summary of issues that I pulled out, or you know, that have been coming up, that seem to me to have been issues of debate or key issues. So it might be that people want to add to these. And I've put at the top of the question, what do we want to transition towards? So we talk about the need for just transition, but what is it? What is our vision of what we're transitioning towards? You know, what is our vision of this low carbon economy? And that's a very broad question. And we can't really answer that until we're getting into some of the specifics. But I think it's a useful question to put up there up front. And linked to that is a question of what do we want a transformed energy system to look like? And I think there, you know, there were a lot of issues that came up, the role of Eskom, the role of other entities, the role of local government, community organizations, and how do they all fit together? So I think that's also quite a big and broad question. I think what also came up very strongly, I think it came up in Sean and Daniel's inputs, was that the transition to renewable energy is not just going to happen through market mechanism. It's going to need state intervention. It's going to need, you know, public intervention for it to actually happen. Very strongly coming up, I think, in Comrade Vavi's inputs, in Nomsa's inputs, is opposition to privatization. That we don't want to put energy into private hands. That we want to see energy remaining as a public good in meeting public needs and in public hands. Linked to that was the whole notion of energy democracy, and I think that came up in some of the international inputs. But you know, maybe we need to give it a little bit more flesh. What exactly do we mean by energy democracy? At various levels of sort of national, provincial, and local. Linked to that, those two other points. What is the line between public and private? You know, there's a big gray area. How do we deal with that gray area? What is our approach to that gray area where there's a bit of a blurring between public and private? How do we fit that into our overall energy systems? Then there's two questions. Do we need a separate transmission entity? I know that's a hot issue. Do we need a separate renewable energy entity? Those issues both came up yesterday. I have a feeling that there are quite strong positions on those, but those are certainly issues that we need to debate. The issue of the demand for energy. So we say the demand for energy has fallen, and yet at the same time we know that there's huge energy poverty. And how do we put those two together? How do we say, you know, demand has fallen and yet there's such energy poverty? How do we connect those two? And it relates to the question of whose interests are we transforming the energy system for? Then it came to the issue of Eskom. I don't think anybody has a position that we just leave Eskom. I think everybody has a position, you know, that Eskom needs to change. Eskom needs to be transformed. There was also talk of a new Eskom, and I'm not sure if when people talk about a transformed Eskom, it's the same thing as a new Eskom. So I think that needs to be sorted out and debated and cleared up. Are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about a new Eskom, as in get rid of the old one and, you know, build from the ground up, from the start, a new institution? Or are we saying, you know, there's Eskom, how do we transform it? So I think that's something that needs to be clarified. And then related to Eskom was a whole range of issues, predominantly the financial issue and the financial mess that Eskom is in. And I think Salim gave us quite a clear picture of that yesterday. Two areas under that I just picked up on was the debt. and the huge debt that Eskom is operating under, and the question of the use of PIC funds, because I think that was raised yesterday or Monday, and people did have questions about that. The issue of governance, we didn't talk about that much, actually, but I think it's something that has to come into any discussion about how we take discussions around Eskom forward. So it's the issue of governance, and then there was the issue of should Eskom be taking on renewable energy, which obviously links to some of the previous questions, but it was a question of do we say that Eskom should be bringing in renewable energy into that public utility as a way of moving forward on the transition. Then the issue of the socio-economic impact of the transition, and the point I think was raised that kind of understanding of the impact of the transition is not in anything like the IRP. It's not in anything like the climate change bill. Those dimensions are often not taken into account, are often not referred to. We need to remember that there is going to be an impact on coal mining communities, quite a major impact. So it's not just jobs that we're talking about. I think that was the point being raised. It's also a whole kind of expanded impact on communities around the coal mines. Then we came on to a discussion about the possibilities of a hybrid form of horizontal integration, where local government plays a role, as well as community organizations, as well as the public utility Eskom. So how we unpack that kind of a system. Then we came onto the issue of industrialization for a low carbon economy and what that involves, what that entails, and the issue of a renewable energy manufacturing sector. And I think we had a very inspiring example from Uruguay about how they sat down and worked out which components of wind turbines they could manufacture internally, and we so we need to have discussion about how we build the manufacturing, what aspects of the manufacturing sector. We heard the role that NUMSA had played in with the solar water heaters in manufacturing, and how we can take that kind of example forward. So linking to all of this was the issue of jobs, that there are going to be job losses on top of huge unemployment, and what job possibilities are there in the transition. The issue of the IRP only talking to 2030 and what happens post 2030, that was raised, that we can't just deal with this as on its own as the IRP now. We have to be thinking about what's going to happen after this IRP. The issue of the Chinese investment came up as a very hot issue, and its implications for coal. That was a major issue. And then also the issue of the Southern African region. That South Africa plays a major role in sending energy to surrounding countries, and how do we, in talking about a transition within South Africa, how do we unpack how it's going to impact on the region as a whole, and the kind of synergies between the neighboring countries and South Africa, and what's happening in South Africa. And then I just put as other issues, because these came up, but they weren't maybe they weren't majorly debated, the issue of trade, and I think that linked to the manufacturing sector. So how we relate to that issue. The issue of land didn't come up much in this conference, but it has come up in the previous workshop. And we haven't discussed, in South Africa, there's a big debate happening right now around land expropriation and reclaiming land. And we have to discuss renewable energy in relation to that debate, or that debate in relation to land. Because renewable energy can take up, it can have quite a large land footprint, and it can impact on communities. So we need to be actually discussing the relationship between renewable energy and land. And I think at the last workshop, one of the issues, for instance, that we heard was that some of these renewable energy solar farms are located on private farms. They're on private land, which makes union access to those plants difficult. So there are all sorts of issues related to land that we actually need to be starting to unpack and linking it to the broader debate around land expropriation. And then just as a side issue, well, it's not a side issue, but there's kind of a feeling that we need to deal with our own position before we maybe start engaging government too much. But just noted that government, has these very contradictory positions. On the one hand, they make commitments around climate change and greenhouse gas emission reductions. On the other hand, they continue with coal. They keep renewable energies quite small, etc. So just recognizing that contradiction. So I think those were the kind of main issues that I identified as emerging. I don't know if anybody wants to comment or identify other issues that I might have neglected. Richard, maybe I'll write them on here. Yep.
Financialization, which is sort of in some of the things you mentioned there, but I think needs identification separately, because some of the problems we have with the Independent Power Producers Office is around how it's facilitating financialization. And it's also one of the dynamics that arises when we reach a more capital-intensive electricity generation technology. So renewables are very capital-intensive. So that also means that they tend to be amenable to the financialization. So I wouldn't put that as a separate point. It's just a sort of, financialization is not just about it happening, but also the dynamics between financialization and the characteristics of low carbon economy.
Yeah, I tried to raise yesterday the question of not ignoring other sources of energy like uranium and shale gas, because there are plans afoot, there are lobbies. Even though we think that the IRP has killed off the idea of reactors over the next few years, that hasn't gone away entirely. And there are problems with both of those industries, and there will be impacts, huge impacts. So I think we have, if we come up with proposals, we have to include treatment of those sources in the proposals. And then just on the question of amplifying the land question, there's a lot of competition especially in Mpumalanga, around the question of land use between the use for coal concessions and arable land used for food production. And we only have 14% of our land is arable, so we're already teetering on a food security, food sovereignty crisis. And by allowing lots more coal concessions, we're actually compromising our food security. So how do we raise that as part of the question on land?
Okay, thanks. So I put the issue of not forgetting other forms of I've linked it to the IRP.
Yeah, that's
because I think it's making sure that we don't get complacent about those forms of energy. Brian.
I don't know if you've got on your issues the question of coal and political economy and the restructuring of the coal industry, because that's pretty important to some of the cost drivers in Eskom's financial woes. But I wondered, not in terms of identifying issues, but I wondered if it wouldn't be useful to have some discussion before we broke up into groups around this question that Richard raised yesterday, and we debated a little bit around this proposal by Richard and what's her name? Dinga. the breakup of ESCOM, these who are advocating the destruction of ESCOM, I think we should have that discussion, because if we want to have some sort of joint work, it would be helpful to have some sort of common framework that we agreed on. So I'm just, speaking as a ESCOM shop steward now. Okay.
Okay, should we have that now, or should we allow the groups to have some discussion and then maybe flag that as a key issue, and maybe that's going to end up being the key issue to discuss, because it does seem to me quite a fundamental issue of how we take forward the discussion around public utilities and ESCOM, etc. But maybe it would be useful just to give people a chance to break into groups, have a chance to think through these issues, think through. Maybe the second question is a question to focus on first. What are the key issues? That's quite a shopping list. That's quite a huge list of issues. What issues should we be focusing on? Given the situation we're facing now, and then it's really three questions. Then how can we consolidate work going forward, and are there specific events? So maybe it's those three questions. Richard?
I just have a question, and it's really for comrades who might have been following this, whether the Jobs Summit is seen as any kind of opportunity, or whether it's just like totally off the radar, because it's due to happen in about a month, and it seems to have a lot of buy-in from the private sector. But from what I've been hearing, Labour hasn't been very vocal there, but maybe I just haven't heard about it. So I just wondered if anyone could give any insight as to whether there's hopes that the Jobs Summit will have something to offer, or whether it's rather perceived as just a government getting tight with business exercise that doesn't really offer traction to social movements.
Any quick responses to that? And then I'll ask. Does anybody know how anybody's reacting to the Job Summit?
Well, the Job Summit is going to be the 3rd and 4th, or 4th and 5th. I can't remember offhand the dates. It's
October.
Yeah, and it's being run by the unit in the presidency, and it's factored around the Nedlac partners. So there is some scope, and I know that tomorrow there's a meeting between SAFTU and this unit to discuss SAFTU's involvement, because they're not part of an EDNA. And then I know that several community groups have also engaged to ask whether they can participate equally. So there's a task team that's looking at this. Whether it should be a key issue and if we put a lot of energy around, that's a useful thing to think about. I know that some groups that we're working with have a kind of strategy of going there to protest the crisis that we're facing, as well as maybe so kind of dual strategy.
Okay, Daniel has a hand up, or is this on the same issue?
No.
Who's? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm afraid that if we continue having this conversation, we're going to keep adding issues that are all relevant, but we shouldn't forget the focus of this conference that is already in the title of the conference, that has to do with the role of public utilities. And I think we should try to zoom into ESCOM and alternative for ESCOM, because from a non-South African perspective, that seems to be the key issue in this country. So I would suggest to focus on that. And the other thing has to do with the work that Shumi has been doing, that she has been recording all these exchanges. So it would be nice that you let us know how we can access this material. I think it's going to be available on YouTube. And then we are going to collect all the presentations, and we are going to circulate it before we publish the report that Sandra has announced. So hopefully maybe next week you will get a link with a way to access the presentation.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel. I think that is useful. I think there's a stage that we could go all over the place. Can I suggest that we break into groups? How do we take forward the issues that have been identified, particularly thinking through the ESCOM related, the public utility, let me not maybe say ESCOM, the public utility issues, and the debates that have emerged around the public utilities and the role of public utilities. And let's break into groups. Let's see how we take it forward and then have plenary report days. We were going to suggest 4 groups, but I'm wondering if we should just do 3. And I think if we just number off, so that if you sat down this morning hoping to be in the same group as your neighbor, it's not going to happen. 1, Rebecca, 2, Matthews, 3, 1. Thank you. I nearly said 4. 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Is there?
My corner.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1.
Zonke number one. Zonke number one. Zonke number one. Oh, zonke number one. Zonke number one. Let's get going.
So hopefully everybody remembers their.
All the number ones.
I don't think there was anybody in the next door room, so I'm sure we could just colonize.
Number one in this we colonizing this corner.
Occupy.
Number one.
If one group wants to go
Number
next door,
one,
there
number
doesn't
one.
seem to be anybody there. But number one, bingo.
Yeah, number one. Zogalanga nenu. Zogalanga nenu. Number one. Sorry.
Where's
Number one. Zongalanga nenu.
Timeko, what number are you?
Yeah, he's there. You see, he went out of the room. And then he wants to come and come to me.
One is where?
This is
Your one.
All right. It's 10 o'clock now. If we can come back, if you can end your group discussion at 11,
With a
grab
cup
some
of tea.
tea and be back in this room by 10 past 11 for report backs. Ready with report backs. Okay.
Also, we are one.
Grab the chairs.